Hi, I'm Riley. I'm going to be playing Steve the Skull.
Hi, I'm Garrett and I'll be playing Frederick the Frog.
I'm Trey, and I'll be playing Petey the Pumpkin. Yay!
What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?
In the book, Raisin in the Sun, there are many dreams deferred. The American dream in the book differs depending on the person and how they define success. There are three great examples of the American dream in the book: Benita, Mama, and Walter.
First, we will talk about Walter's dream. Walter's dream was to use the insurance tech to invest in a liquor store, which he thought would solve the family's financial problems forever. Instead of giving the money to him, Mama used the money to buy a house, which made him angry and killed him. To save his dream, she gave him the remaining $6,500, which made him head of the family. He gave the rest of the money to his friend Willie Harris to invest in the liquor store, but instead of investing it, he ran off with the money. Walter's world revolved around money, and once he lost it all, he didn't know what to do. He eventually attains one of his goals, which is being leader of the family. At the end of the book, when he stands up to Linda by keeping the house, he found pride and ownership.
Next, we will talk about Mama's dream. Mama's dream was to use the money to buy a house with a yard for her family, and eventually see Walter become the head of the family. She has struggled with providing for the family, and felt guilty that her family had to live in an apartment. The family was falling apart, and she knew something needed to change. She thinks by getting a house it will give Walter pride and responsibility over the family. Realizing Walter was not happy with her decision, after she put a down payment on the house, she gave him the remaining money out of guilt. She also made him the head of the family. She was very angry at Walter when he lost the money, but she became proud of him when he did what was best for the family by standing up to Mr. Linder and turning down the money.
Lastly, we'll talk about Benita's dream. Benita wanted to use the money for medical school tuition and reconnect with her African roots. She didn't understand why the family, especially Walter, was so interested in joining the white world. But she decided to find her identity by looking into her African ancestry. We see in the book that she cut her hair after Assegai says she is trying too hard to conform to her American and white hairstyles after straightening her hair. She struggled choosing between two guys, Assegai and George. Assegai and George were opposites, George being an African American who had submitted to white culture, and Assegai being an African American who would not conform and was very knowledgeable about his African roots. We see at the end of the book that she turns down George in his white way of living, but it is left unanswered whether she chose to go back to Nigeria with Assegai and become a doctor. She struggled with her identity as an African American woman.
We see a bunch of different viewpoints from one family of what the American dream was. While no one successfully achieved their entire dream, we see in the end the family ends up content and united.
Some folks are born silver spoon in hand. Y'all don't they help themselves, y'all. But when the tax man comes to the job, y'all the house looking like a rummage sale, yes. It ain't me, I ain't no millionaire son.
Hey guys, I'm Petey the Pumpkin. Today we're going to talk about beatnik literature in the Vietnam War. Yay!
As we discuss beatnik literature, we will go over a couple different stories written in the 50s to 70s that led to movements such as civil rights and the hippies era.
In Self, in 1958, by Anne Sexton, we look at an abstract poem that is displaying restrictions that women had back in the 60s as they struggled to find their identity. Yay!
Women were condemned to the typical housewife role in the mid-1900s, and as a result, they weren't allowed to play a major role in society.
Woohoo for housewives. In One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Casey, the story displays a theme that society is always tempted to conform to their surroundings.
The mental institution represents society conforming to this certain image. However, there's always someone who is against conforming, and it causes an uprising.
Uprising? What? This reflects the 1950s because the oppression of conformity leads to African Americans oppressing slavery and standing up for their rights. I have a dream. This was commonly seen during the 60s as African Americans began the bus boycott and Martin Luther King led nonviolent protest.
In How, by Allen Ginsberg, transcendentalists are seen as outcasts that are suffering. They use drugs and alcohol to experience this transformation.
Don't do drugs. In the story, Moloch, the god of abominations, uses the beatniks as sacrifices. The young kids of the 1950s are sacrificed as they turn from the parents' traditions to living this new transcendental life.
This causes society to lose their visionary consciousness, and a society without a vision is corrupt.
Corrupt. Good morning, Vietnam! You! After reading the Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, it was pretty obvious that each soldier had a personal possession that they carried with him to cope with the war.
For example, Ted Lavender carried tranquilizers and would use them to keep him calm in the midst of battles and gunfire. Dave Jensen would carry extra pairs of socks to prevent himself from getting trench foot. Medic Rat Kiley would carry morphine and pills during the battles.
The soldiers all carried a personal possession because they felt that it would help them take their mind off the war and all the bloods and death that was occurring. None of the soldiers wanted to be in Vietnam, and these soldiers were just trying to make it out alive. They took along everything they could to give them a sense of confidence and assurance in surviving.
The Vietnam War was one of the most costly wars in U.S. history. Over 50,000 lives were lost, and 300,000 soldiers were wounded throughout the war. After watching videos of soldiers being interviewed, it became obvious that not many of the soldiers were happy to be there.
You know, Steve, it's such a shame that our soldiers went to Vietnam to fight this pointless war and came home and often were not viewed as heroes because of the television incidents that were reported during this war. With this war being the first televised war, many people back home thought of the soldiers as murderers and terrible people. It's such a shame what media does to people these days.